Coming up, part one of a two-part episode with the amazing Matt Brooks from Net Daily and from the Clear Out podcast, where we start out by discussing the superstars. Is the simple answer that Kevin Durant has been bad? We'll talk about that, plus Kyrie Irving and the magical disappearing act that was game two, all coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, it's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Armbrecht. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms. With no delay, we dive right in with a great conversation with Matt Brooks from Nets Daily and the Clear Out podcast. Welcome into another crossover podcast, this time with the Locked On Nets team. As you know, myself, Adam Armbrecht, and Doug Norrie, and then joined by not only the host of the Clear Out podcast, also a writer producing content over for Nets Daily, Matt Brooks. How are you, sir?
I'm good. Good to be back. I wish the playoffs were going to be I'm just hoping this Nets run goes a little longer than it's about to look. I'll put it like that.
Okay, Doug, quickly get in here. Just a lot of salutations. Matt's gotten us off to a very positive start. I think we can just hit the ground running now.
Well, I'll tell you right now, if you want to even just go into the not part of the feel part of this part, but just the statistical part of it, even just falling down 2-0 is almost a death knell. Like over the course of NBA history, it's something like 94% of team. I get that the Nets are not the typical team to fall down 2-0, but over the course of the entirety of NBA history, when teams have fallen down 2-0 in any series, there's about a 6% chance that they come out of it. And I don't want to hear about the part where the Bucks did it last year, because I already got dragged through the mire with that one. So I'm totally aware the Bucks did it last year.
There's some good sample sizes on Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, though, over the course of their career being on 0-2 teams and still pulling it out. But no need for that type of saving grace just yet. From a high level, we're going to get into the reason why we want to obviously get on with Matt is because the X's and O's, the film study, he goes back and rewatches these games and really gets down to the nooks and crannies of it all. But just to start from a super high level, Matt, how surprising have these first two games been for you when you watch Kevin Durant? Not about what Boston's doing to him, just Kevin Durant, apex predator, superstar in the league, seemingly looking like this is the first time that he's been on a big stage and had to overcome some difficult basketball.
Yeah, it's surprising. I think the thing for me is like just the way he's playing into Boston's hands in a way. Like that was, usually when I grab clips, just a disclaimer to people, when I watch games, I like grab individual clips and I label them and I write about who's responsible for the play or whatever. I would say a good 50-60% of my clips are KD. And a lot of them are just like missed passes, him dribbling one too many times. Like it's stuff that is strange to see from any player, but especially from KD, who's 33. He's been kind of playing point guard for the Nets for a majority of this year. And it just sort of feels like the wheels have fallen off in terms of that. I don't even want to call it an experiment because he's done it for a while now where he's kind of manned ball handling duties, but the wheels have kind of fallen off in a way, and he just seems really lost right now. And I don't know. It's strange. It's just bizarre watching him play this poorly.
And we talked about this after the following game too, and I'm going to be careful about how I frame this because I realized in retrospect it's kind of wrong. But I wondered about how off it looked for him that if you compare it to other sports, especially with very repeatable processes, like I compared it to a baseball pitcher, right? Where it's like, hey, when this baseball pitcher who's been doing this thing for legit his 10,000 hours plus, right? And it's been at a super excellent high level. And then if the wheels completely come off, my mind always just goes to injury because I'm like, those are sometimes the only things to explain it, right? And then with baseball pitchers, they inevitably end up in the 10-day DL, and it's like, oh, is their forearm hurt? I do not think Kevin Durant is injured, but the mistakes that he's making defy explanation, even to me, and maybe you see this too, beyond just Boston's making it hard for him, which they clearly are, right? But the parts where the dribble is lost, the parts where even the passes he makes aren't weighted properly, like it feels like something is off more than it is. And it could just be weird 2-game sample size and he's had struggled to get into a rhythm. Does that make sense? Like I'm not saying he's injured, but sometimes when things are so outside of the norm, especially when you have a massive sample size of a dude, it just doesn't. It's
Doesn't
weird.
compute.
It doesn't totally compute. And then your uncanny valley piece of your mind starts being like, okay, well, I need to like make up the difference here. I need to make up this last little percentage of why this looks so bad.
I think Boston deserves a lot of credit, honestly. Like the way they've been, I actually think like in general, at least because I only see, I'll see national people, but I'd mostly see like Nets, I guess on Twitter and stuff like that. I'm usually seeing Nets perspectives. I actually think Boston probably deserves a little more credit than they're getting. They've just been so good at, kind of sinking in on the elbows when he's posting up in the middle. If he's in the post, a guy's coming down from the entry pass and another guy's rotating over at that exact same time. Like they've just been so in sync together, and you watch them work as a unit that I just think like for Durant, seeing that wall of players all the time is kind of eating away at him mentally. And for me, it's like, I kind of, this has been my big concern with him is instead of being like, all right, if I know there are 2 guys in front of me or 3 guys in front of me, if I can just make, it doesn't even need to be the assist. If it can just be the pass that ignites swing action, that's great. But he's not doing that. I feel like he's doing the complete opposite and being like, all right, this is time. I'm going to show the world I'm Kevin Durant, best scorer in the world. And it's just kind of like, you're just not going to win that way. You're just not.
It's funny too, because you go back to game number 1 where he starts out very sloppy and careless with the basketball. And if you cover and watch the Nets, you know that that's been a theme for him. He's had just some lackadaisical ball handling, especially down the stretch of the season. But you just mentioned it's like there seems to be a stubbornness there. Now, on the one hand, you'd say, right, well, every great superstar player should be stubborn and believe that they can get back to their rhythm, back to their game. But that almost seems like he's pressing now, because even in game number 2, there was a sequence where he had 2 out of 3 possessions. He was solely responsible for the turnovers, and they specifically led to easy transition baskets for Boston. And that's when it actually took the lead from, I think, 7-10 down to single digits and down to a single possession. And I think that's probably like the layer deeper on his struggles are, yes, Boston is impacting him, but Kevin Durant is compounding what Boston is doing to him by further making mistakes. And now it pushes him into the space of saying, we all still agree that he is Kevin Durant, but it pushes him into a space where he's doing damage to the Nets, even beyond just having a rough shooting performance and struggling to get into his rhythm. Is that just because he thinks he can get there, because he wants to lift up this team? Because that's what surprised me most in game number 2 is he went right back to that well and didn't lean into something that I called for, which was be more of a facilitator like you were down the stretch of the season. Averaged almost 2.5 more assists after the Harden trade, had 5 assists in game number 2.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. I also would say like I think like in terms of what Boston's done, just playing him as physically as they have, I think that's always been the blueprint to a degree. One, you're like getting in his spots and making his catches a little bit tougher. You're not really giving him room to like, even because he likes to dribble into his shots. They're just cutting that off. So he kind of has to like, move his body around. It's not like the most, I guess, graceful way for him to get into his setup. And a lot of times when he gets around these guys, he's kind of angled strange to the basket because he's had to push around their bodies essentially. So I think in a way, just like pressuring him like that from a standstill has helped. And they just have really taken like a page out of PJ Tucker's book and done, and I'm sure like, Ime saw that last year and was like, interesting. This seems to be a strategy. What if we did that, but we also brought over help from, I don't know, Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, who are 2 of the most athletic wings in the league, especially Jaylen. And we're going to have those guys, shift over and dig down if he tries to make a spin move or something like that, and then recover back because they have the length to do it. So it's a perfect recipe for them. They've got the right guys out there. They got Grant Williams, who's just got a low base and seems to like get into KD in that way that we've seen work in the past. Marcus Smart's another guy. Kind of reminds me a little bit of when Chris Paul used to give KD trouble way back when he was on OKC. So it's just like it's the perfect recipe of things that are going to bother KD, I think, in a way.
Okay, we're going to get more into the conversation with Matt Brooks. First, got to talk to you about our friends over at True Build. Do you know why free trials renew without your consent? It's easy. is because those businesses are out to get you. Those corporations want to pocket your money. You need to download Truebill right now to take control of your subscriptions. Truebill is a new app that helps you identify and stop paying for subscriptions you don't want, you don't need, or you just simply forgot about. On average, wait for this number, people save up to $720 a year with Truebill. Imagine what you can do with that extra savings. Companies like to make subscriptions hard to cancel. Truebill makes it incredibly simple. You just link your accounts. Truebill will cancel your unwanted subscriptions in one tap. It's like a concierge service for all those subs you don't want. Truebill has over 2 million users and helped to save them over, wait for this number, $100 million. Don't fall for subscription scams. Start canceling today at Truebill.com/LockedOnNBA. Go right now. Truebill.com/LockedOnNBA. You could save you thousands a year.
And when you've saved those thousands a year, why don't you go ahead and spend it on something that's good for you? And that's going to be with our friends over at Built Bar, because as you know, if you're looking to get yourself a dose of protein, you're not looking to put bad products into your body that are just going to drag you down. No, my friends. Built Bar remains that first one-of-a-kind producer of the Puffs marshmallow infused protein bars. You got to love that. You know that they're going to be covered in 100% real chocolate, and even the Puffs are also covered in that 100% real chocolate. You'll get those stat lines, as we like to talk about: 130 calories, just 4 grams of sugar, just 4 grams of net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to 240 calories in a candy bar. 30 grams or more inside of those of sugar? I don't think so, my friends. Delicious flavors. If you can think of one, they've probably already produced it, because they have mint brownie, coconut almond, and even cookies and cream. You go over to built.com right now, use promo code LOCKED15. You're going to get 15% off on your order. You use promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com.
And like the physicality piece, which is so clear, right? I mean, it's so clear, and there becomes a real weird dividing line between, okay, everyone understands regular season basketball and playoff basketball are built differently. And so I don't think there's anyone that would make a contention that that's not the case. But then when you go into a series like this, it's always going to be a little unclear about what the, like, sort of where it'll be allowed to go to, right? And we saw that with Tucker. That's a great call on Tucker. Saw that with him last year, where at times it seemed like, hey, like, what is going to be allowed here? Because it seems like everything is allowed in terms of you just being as physical and literally doing whatever you want the entire time. And now you have, like you said, maybe 5 players on the team, or 3 if you want, like you want to say like Horford and Grant Williams, and then like Marcus Smart, let's say, or guys that will have no problem continuing to do that over and over and over again. There probably is something like an adjustment period, even for a guy like KD and the whole team, to understand and to work their way out of it, because things that would have been fouls clearly during the course of the year. It's okay. I'm not even saying that the refs doing a bad job. It's just a different brand of basketball. But like, is there a way to overcome the physicality at this point? Because if this is going to be the case, is there a way for KD and then I guess the team writ large to be able to work their way out of it? Or are you just like, hey, you're just going to need to overcome it in some way? Is there an X's and O's way out of it? Or is it just like, hey, this is just what it is, so maybe they're just not built for it? It's a defeatist kind of line at the end, but it's weird, because it's like, well, if this is just going to be it, I mean, is there a functional way around it?
Screen better, I guess. That would be one way, but I mean, the Celtics are going to switch and then grab onto KD, because they'll do that even if you set a good screen. The guy that's, I guess, guarding the screener then like literally grabs onto KD. So I don't know, maybe adding multiple screens to actions, running more of like stagger screens versus just solo pin downs for KD, make guys have to go through more, I guess, bodies in a sense. So I don't know. That's a tough question. I think probably the biggest thing they can do is get home and hope that there's a little bit of home cooking from the officiating. Like that's the best I can come up with right now.
Before we get to, because I want to touch on Kyrie as well, because he fell off the cliff there in game number 2 also, and that there's alarming aspects of his performance as well. Do you just try to keep Kevin Durant off the ball? Do you try to set up the offense where he is not on ball working into the set, where Boston is walking out the first and then second defender, and because Kevin Durant is struggling to make that adjustment and get the ball out of his hands quicker, even if only to receive it back, do you try to say, hey, Kyrie, you need to be the one? Because for all the physicality of Boston, Kyrie Irving isn't struggling with that part of the game. He's able to get his, at least going back to game number 1. Is it I think Doug hates this phrase, addition by subtraction, of like, have the ball in Kevin Durant's hands less so that when it is in his hands, he can hopefully be more effective, because it feels like he's being ground down over the course of the game, so that even the good looks are bad because he's been getting absolutely beaten up for 3.5, 4 quarters.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't want him handling. I mean, he actually, you know what? I I don't know. So they used him a little bit as a screener. I felt like they did that a little bit more in game 2 to game 1. And what the goal was to screen and then, it was usually like Derek White or somebody like that. They'd have him screen and then KD would drag Derek White to about like the middle of the free throw line. And even on those touches, it's like the Nets weren't really able to get anything because Boston would then send 2 help defenders at the elbows and kind of like pressure his touches. So Boston's just prepared for everything the Nets are doing right now with KD, which is a problem. Yeah, because that was my big adjustment. I'm like, all right, have KD screen a little bit more, and you can have him like, if you can get him in the middle of the floor, I think that could work well, because it's harder to help when you're in the middle of the floor versus if you're on one side or the other. You can kind of like map out your defenders. If you put a guy in the middle, it's ideally you're supposed to have easier touches, but because Boston's so long and athletic, they are able to make up ground that way. And KD's not looking to make that pass anyways. So, yeah, I think like, I don't know. I think I would maybe just continue to try to use screening acts with him and see if he can set better screens. I thought he had some okay plays out of the pick and roll, especially with like Bruce Brown. He had a couple reads. I think he also missed a few too, but you just sort of hope that those start to open up for him and he starts to look for the pass a little bit more. And I think that's the best you can do right now, is if you're just mixing that in enough versus, hey, we're going to run pick and roll and KD is going to be running it for 4 possessions in a row, or, oh, KD is going to now be screening for this portion of the game. If you can mix those in a little bit more, I think that would help for sure.
All right, we're going to finish up with Matt Brooks here. It's been a great conversation so far. First, we're going to talk to you about our friends over at betonline.net. Betonline.net is your number one source for all of your betting stats and sports info. It's got the sports developments you need. They got league reviews, news. It's really a one-stop shop for all of your betting needs. They're going to take you through the basketball playoffs. They got Major League Baseball action up there. Really every sport you can imagine. Go over to Europe for some stuff as well. BetOnline has it all. It's your continued source for all of your sporting wagering information. They have live betting as well. Head on over to betonline.net. You can use that mobile device. You learn about all the trends. You learn about all the action. Bet online, where the game starts.
Okay, so then pause on the adjustments that we can or cannot see Kevin Durant make in this game. The other one was Kyrie Irving, 39-point performance in game number 1, 2 full days off of rest, comes back and virtual no-show. As Doug pointed out in the post game, it's very rare when you can be watching a Nets game and go, I didn't realize Kyrie Irving was on the court. I'll put in the caveat. We know Ramadan, he's observing the fasting. He ducked away midway through the first quarter to be able to get some energy into himself. I can't label that as the excuse. He's been through that for a number of years now. The biggest thing that I want to just point to on him is only 13 shot attempts, but just 1 assist. And Doug highlighted this last episode as well. 16 total assists in that game, a season low for the Brooklyn Nets. When you see that your partner in Kevin Durant is struggling, what is Kyrie Irving's responsibility there? And how much do you look at maybe not just the struggles from a scoring perspective, but again, we'll get into supporting cast here, guys that were having some success. Is it equally as alarming that Kyrie struggled shooting and also struggled being able to have an impact on this game other ways offensively?
Yeah, I thought, he wasn't as bad as KD in terms of like missing passes. I also just don't think he had as many opportunities to like actually pass because KD had the ball in his hands so much. I thought the part for me, like if you're looking at anything Kyrie wise, where you're just puzzled, was that stretch in the fourth quarter when they had Peyton Pritchard out there and the Nets, I don't think they targeted him once. And you got Kyrie out there, like you watched game 1. How did Kyrie get going? Oh, that's right. He had Peyton Pritchard in front of him and he hit a couple of pull-up threes in front of him. And it's like, if you know that guy's out there and you have Kyrie out there, first half, have Kyrie have the ball. Second off, have the guy who Peyton Pritchard was guarding, who I think was Patty Mills, have him screen so that you're bringing Peyton Pritchard in there because the Celtics are switching everything. And the Nets, they just didn't do that. If anything, they were like, Kyrie was like stuffed in the corner quite a bit. And I just thought that was puzzling, that when I was watching it back again, it's like he didn't even want to go get the ball. He wasn't being aggressive about that. And that's just not going to work for you. You need him to be aggressive at that point when it's only him. There's no KD. If it's just him, he needs to be aggressive.
Yeah, blew an open, which is for him an open layup at one point, like late down the stretch where he had gotten past. I think he even gotten past Smart in that one. When he gets going downhill, I mean, like we all know this. He's among the best finishers in the league, and definitely like the best finisher for his size. So, when it comes to going in traffic, so even little things like that become indicative of what is like a larger problem, which is to say, if he can't get going also, whether, which kind of at this point needs to be by hook or by crook, right? Like it's whether it's hunting down the matchups or just taking advantage of the few times where it seemed like it was working. If that's not going to happen, then it just becomes, like you said, like doubly perplexing. And, sometimes I think with these situations where a guy becomes invisible, sometimes like you said, it's because there was just like a lack of maybe not wanting to go toward the ball, but just not being as incentivized, whether he felt like he didn't have it in those situations, or whether they just weren't calling out the right plays. But like, is that situation, like, after rewatching it, do you see that situation as just correctable? Because again, I sometimes look at these things and say, I don't think these are indicative sometimes of larger Nets problems. It'd be impossible to think that we have too large of a sample size that shows that they just don't typically have these problems. Or is this unique matchup against this maybe team that was kind of built maybe perfectly? And thank God Robert Williams isn't playing, because I don't even know what it would look like.
God.
But like, that's not talked about. I forget about we'll talk about Ben Simmons, but could you imagine if this was Robert Williams, Time Lord, instead of Dice? I mean, my God. Anyway, but my original point was, do you think this is
getting deeper into how bad this could be?
Jesus. Yeah, my bad. Are we at a point now where it's like, is this part of it correctable too? Because this feels like an outlierish piece of Kyrie's game, which I can see us going into game 3 and be like, oh, I'll forget about that happened, right? Because we just have too large of a sample size where it just hasn't happened this way.
Yeah, I mean, Kyrie has games like this where he's just passive, and it just like sometimes it's only for a half, and then there's games like this where it lasts the whole game, and it puzzles me whenever this happens. There's a possession in the fourth where I think the Nets got I think they got a rebound and they pushed, or Dragic pushed, and he kicked to Patty Mills. Patty Mills took a 3. The Nets got the rebound, and it ended up in Seth Curry's hands. And Seth has got, I think, Al Horford in front of him. And Seth like jab steps a couple times, tries to create. And Kyrie's just standing on the other side of the floor, like watching the whole thing happen. And I'm sitting there rewatching this. I'm like, Kyrie, like, go give him an outlet. Go help him out. Why is Seth Curry sitting there jab stepping with, 8 seconds left on the shot clock? It ends up being like a heave from Goran Dragic. And it was just like one of those possessions where when Kyrie's locked in, he's going to go help his teammate out. When he's not, when it's, for whatever reason, if he's not locked in that situation, that's just a dead possession. And, they got the offensive rebound. Like, that was a free opportunity to add points to the board. And it's like, you end up with, a heave. So I was pretty disappointed with that.
I wanted to flip over onto the defensive side, where for the most part, I think you live with the results. Some of the matchups, the size, it is what it is. We know Drummond had an otherworldly poor performance in game 1, and I think at least gave you closer to what your expectations are in game number 2. Sometimes I think fans have over evaluated what Drummond is capable of doing, and that's what
he's a vet min center. All right, like, let's.
So there we are, friends. You heard it from Matt Brooks, right there. When we brought him in, it was not for him to be a dominant 35-minute a game center. But just quickly on Kyrie, as we talk about defense, you said about when he's locked in. When he's locked in, he's a tenacious defender with the quick hands and being disruptive and getting into passing lanes. Like, he can be a real pest. And again, this is that part where you go, okay, maybe it's not there for you offensively, and you're going to be a little bit in the shadows. You can still impact the game on the other end of the floor, especially when you look over, because we're not going to get too much into what went well for Boston from an offensive standpoint. But, Jason Tatum hasn't gone off in these first 2 games. He had a very consistent game number 2, far better, I think, just from a total impact than in game number 1. But you're losing these games in the margins, and some of those margins are the effort piece, and that will tie both these guys into it. The effort piece seems to be the component that's lacking in both of your superstars, which is alarming to say the least. And then also just from the understanding of, you are the ones that are going to sway the tide in these close games. And that's what both these first 2 games have been. Close games that, as we talk about defense, Brooklyn has been leading in both of these games as well, and seemingly has fallen apart late to allow Boston to steal both of them.
Yeah, I mean, I thought Brooklyn's role players were pretty decent defensively.
Yep.
Bruce Brown was great against Jason Tatum and just like made his touches tough. And there wasn't anybody that really stood out. I think they survived with Patty Mills out there, which is like always the goal. Seth was had like one or two bad possessions, but it was like against like Jaylen Brown. So like, what can you do? I thought KD was really bad. Like, I just thought he was really, 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 really bad defensively, like worse than game one defensively in a way that you just need him to be better. Like, it's one thing if you can't get going on offense, but like you can't be missing rotations on the other end. He was having moments where he'd like overhelp in the paint and then that would leave the corner open. I think Al Horford got 2 or 3 corner threes just because Durant was, either not in great position or just didn't recover back to that corner at all. There were other rotations where it's like a guy rotates over or rotates to the corner, and then you need Durant to shift one over, and he just didn't make the rotation. So I thought I was definitely a little disappointed with him on that side of the ball, especially. It's again, the offense is one thing. I think we've hammered that into the ground. I'm sure every single Nets podcast, national podcast, has touched on Kevin Durant offensively, but for me, like, I just thought the defensive effort was really poor from a guy who's supposed to be one of the leaders, if not the leader of this defense.
And just quickly, Doug, and it's saying a lot to say that you're disappointed in the second game because, one, we've seen how good he can be on defense, Kevin Durant, and two, in game number one, he was the one who just kind of got lost in the middle of the lane where he very easily could have intercepted that pass for Jason Tatum that led to that layup. But go ahead, Doug.
I was just going to say, I think that, beyond just an X's and O's thing, and I tend to not want to go too far into these waters because they're too amorphous and they just kind of, they're hard to evaluate. But I do think that there is a point where I think at some point defense is just a lot about energy too. And like, if you can make up for a lot of deficiencies in scheme and stuff by just being very energetic, sometimes it turns into too many fouls. And so that can be the case. Sometimes even with bad teams, they'll just, just hack everybody. But I think when things are trending the wrong direction is when you just see some of these, because like the things you just mentioned really are more about effort. It's like not about getting lost. It's about just there's the effort's not there. When we see them, storming from behind in the last game, and you can just see an intensity on the defensive end that sometimes bleeds out from whatever you're doing on offense. But if you're not getting in that direction, then it can be hard to sort of dial it up. And already where they're sort of undermatched size wise, like you have to have all the energy at that point. There can't be you can't miss any assignments at that point because there's no room to breathe at that point. You're already playing with the thinnest of margins. Like, do you think, like, is that too non X's and O's? Because I really hate to be the effort guy because I think it's usually the laziest thing to say because it's like calling. It's the same thing I did last night. It's like calling for a timeout because you don't know what else to do. As a fan, like a fan's like they should have called a timeout. I'm like, he had to have another idea besides a timeout, right? Like there has to be
the game.
There has to be another adjustment than just like pause, like you do when you're playing your game because you're too tired. Like I don't think that's it, but I kind of do feel like some of these situations, especially for these guys, it has come down to just. It's almost like what's not happening for them on the one end is bleeding into the other end. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
I think that's the point right there that I want to touch on because I really feel like that with KD this series, especially where it's just like the things that like we know what KD looks like when he's really, really on top of his game defensively. So for me, it's like to see him play this poorly, and it just happens to be in this series where he's not shooting the ball well. I don't think those are like, I think those are correlated. They have to be, you know what I mean?
Right.
So yeah, I think that's the big thing for me is I'm watching this series and Durant's just been bad. Like he's just been bad. He's been really bad. They're not going to win this series if he plays like this.
Right, that's the idea of it can just be that he's been bad. Like that can also be the explanation, right? Like as opposed to
I want to
what's
bring
unraveling.
More.
Right.
I want to bring more, but it's like in every area, this is a guy that like prides himself on being an all-around player. And I think he can be, but it's like, man, like it shouldn't be that if one part of your game falls apart, which is his scoring right now, everything else falls apart. It can't all be linked that way. And it's like his scoring falls apart. So all of a sudden he's not looking to make passes and his handle's falling apart apparently. And then the defense is bleeding. It's just like, I don't know. It's like a Jenga tower right now with KD.